On the morning of the 7th of May, 1942, American dive bombers and torpedo planes from the USS Lexington and USS Yorktown converged on a Japanese aircraft carrier steaming through the Coral Sea. The light carrier Shoho, caught without adequate fighter protection, absorbed hit after hit from bombs and torpedoes. In just 13 minutes of devastating attack, the vessel broke apart and slipped beneath the waves. At approximately 11:36 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon of Scouting Squadron 2 radioed back to the Lexington with a message that would electrify the American fleet. "Scratch 1 Flattop," he reported, watching the enemy carrier disappear into the depths. What Dixon and his fellow pilots didn't know was that this relatively small victory was merely the opening act of a revolutionary new form of warfare, one that would transform naval combat forever and determine the fate of the entire Pacific War. The Battle of the Coral Sea would be the first naval engagement in history where surface ships never exchanged a single shot, where admirals commanded their fleets without ever laying eyes on the enemy, and where the outcome would hinge entirely on young pilots flying fragile aircraft across hundreds of miles of open ocean. The roots of this confrontation stretched back to the 18th of April, 1942, when 16 American B-25 bombers, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, launched from the USS Hornet and struck Tokyo itself. The raid caused minimal physical damage but inflicted a psychological wound that demanded immediate response from the Imperial Japanese Navy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, accelerated plans for 2 major operations designed to extend Japan's defensive perimeter and eliminate American carrier power once and for all. The first objective was Port Moresby on the southern coast of New Guinea, a strategic location that would put Japanese bombers within easy striking distance of northern Australia and sever the vital supply lines between the United States and its Pacific allies. The second was a massive assault on Midway Island, designed to draw out and destroy the American carrier fleet. But Port Moresby came first, and the Japanese High Command assigned Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, commander of the 4th Fleet, to lead Operation MO. Inoue assembled a formidable invasion force. The core striking power consisted of the fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, sister ships displacing 25,675 tons each and carrying a combined total of 145 aircraft. These were elite vessels, part of the carrier force that had devastated Pearl Harbor just 5 months earlier. Captain Takeo Takagi commanded the carrier striking force, with Rear Admiral Tadaichi Hara overseeing air operations. Supporting them was the light carrier Shoho with 21 aircraft, escorting the actual invasion convoy of 11 transport ships carrying the South Seas Detachment, approximately 5,000 troops of the Imperial Japanese Army. Additional heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers rounded out a fleet that represented one of the most powerful naval forces ever assembled in the South Pacific. The Japanese plan called for a 3-pronged approach. The main carrier force would sweep into the Coral Sea from the north. The invasion convoy would approach Port Moresby from the west, through the Jamard Passage, and a smaller force would occupy Tulagi in the Solomon Islands to establish a seaplane base. The operation was scheduled to culminate with the amphibious landing at Port Moresby on the 10th of May. What the Japanese didn't know was that American cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had partially broken the Japanese naval code designated JN-25. By late April, Rochefort's team had identified the target as RZP, which they correctly determined to be Port Moresby, and they had pieced together enough of the operational details to give Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, a critical advantage. Nimitz immediately ordered every available carrier to the Coral Sea. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, flying his flag aboard the USS Yorktown, would command the American response. Fletcher had at his disposal 2 carrier task forces, his own Task Force 17 built around the Yorktown, and Task Force 11 centered on the USS Lexington under Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch. The Yorktown displaced 19,800 tons and carried 90 aircraft, while the larger Lexington, at 36,000 tons, carried 95 aircraft. Both were veteran ships with experienced air groups. Fletcher also had under his command Rear Admiral John Crace's Task Force 44, a joint American-Australian surface force including the cruisers HMAS Australia, HMAS Hobart, and USS Chicago, along with several destroyers. On the 3rd of May, Japanese troops came ashore at Tulagi unopposed, establishing their seaplane base and raising the Japanese flag over the small harbor. Fletcher received word of the landing the following morning, while refueling approximately 450 miles to the south. He immediately detached from his oilers and raced north at 27 knots, covering the distance overnight. At dawn on the 4th of May, Yorktown's aircraft launched the first American offensive strikes of the battle, attacking Japanese shipping and facilities at Tulagi across 3 separate raids. Lieutenant Commander William Birch led the first strike of 28 torpedo planes and dive bombers, achieving complete surprise. The attacks continued throughout the morning, with American pilots claiming they had sunk or damaged numerous vessels. The actual damage was more modest than reported. One Japanese destroyer, Kikuzuki, sunk, several minesweepers and auxiliaries damaged, and importantly, several float planes destroyed on the water. Fletcher expended 76 sorties and 10,136 pounds of bombs for these results, a harbinger of the challenges of aerial warfare at sea. Meanwhile, the main Japanese carrier force, still hundreds of miles to the north, remained completely unaware that American carriers were in the area. The 5th and 6th of May became a period of maneuvering in deteriorating weather. Fletcher withdrew south to refuel again, a time-consuming process that would take his carriers out of position for nearly 2 full days. Both sides launched extensive search patrols, their scouts crisscrossing thousands of square miles of ocean in aircraft that often operated at the very limits of their range. The Coral Sea in early May presented challenging conditions. Visibility varied from excellent to nearly zero as squalls swept across the area, and cloud cover ranged from scattered to overcast. Admiral Takagi pushed south with Shokaku and Zuikaku, searching for American carriers he now suspected were present. Admiral Hera's pilots were among the most experienced in the world, veterans of the Pearl Harbor attack, the Indian Ocean raids, and the conquest of the Dutch East Indies. They flew Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, Aichi D3A Type 99 dive bombers called Vals by the Americans, and Nakajima B5N Type 97 torpedo bombers designated Kates. These aircraft had proved devastatingly effective in combat, and the Japanese pilots had every reason to feel confident. Fletcher, having completed his refueling, steamed northwest to intercept the Port Moresby invasion force, which American intelligence indicated would pass through the Jamard Passage between the 7th and 8th of May. The morning of the 7th of May began with both sides launching scouts at first light. At 7:22 a.m., a pilot from the Yorktown reported sighting 2 carriers and 4 heavy cruisers just 225 miles northwest of Fletcher's position. This was electrifying news, suggesting that the main Japanese carrier force had been located. Fletcher immediately ordered a full strike. 93 aircraft from both Yorktown and Lexington, nearly his entire offensive capability, roared off the flight decks and headed northwest. But the scouting report contained a critical error. What the pilot had actually seen was not 2 carriers, but 2 cruisers, and he had reversed 2 digits in encoding his position. Meanwhile, at 8:20 a.m., a Japanese scout from the Shokaku reported sighting an American carrier and cruiser to the south. Admiral Hera faced exactly the same dilemma as Fletcher: commit his strike aircraft based on this single sighting or wait for confirmation. Like Fletcher, Hera chose to launch immediately, sending 78 aircraft south to attack what the Japanese believed was the main American carrier force. Both strike forces were now airborne, heading toward targets based on incomplete and partially inaccurate information. What happened next revealed the chaos and confusion inherent in this new form of warfare. At 8:40 a.m., another American scout correctly reported the actual Japanese carrier force, Shokaku and Zuikaku, approximately 350 miles to the north. Fletcher now faced an agonizing decision. His strike aircraft were already committed to the northwest. Calling them back would waste precious fuel and time, and by the time they could rearm and relaunch, the Japanese might have escaped, or worse, attacked first. He chose to let the strike continue toward its original target, gambling that whatever ships lay to the northwest would be worth destroying. At 10:40 a.m., the American pilots spotted ships below through broken clouds. It wasn't the main carrier force, but it was the light carrier Shoho, escorting the Port Moresby invasion convoy through the Louisiade archipelago. Commander William Ault from Lexington's air group coordinated the attack, and the American squadrons tore into the smaller carrier with overwhelming force. Shoho never stood a chance. The American pilots, frustrated at having missed the main Japanese carriers, unleashed their full fury on the isolated vessel. Over the course of just 10 minutes, dive bombers from both Yorktown and Lexington screamed down through the anti-aircraft fire, scoring hit after hit with 1,000-pound bombs. Torpedo planes bored in from multiple directions, their 2,000-pound Mark 13 torpedoes tracking straight and true, despite the weapon's notorious reliability problems. Shoho absorbed at least 13 bomb hits and 7 torpedo strikes. Her flight deck erupted in flames as aviation fuel ignited, and the thin armor of the light carrier provided no protection against the onslaught. Survivors reported that Captain Ishinosuke Iwabuchi fought to the end, but by 11:35 a.m., barely 13 minutes after the attack began, Shoho rolled over and disappeared beneath the waves, approximately 20 miles south of Des Moines Island. Of her crew of 834 men, 631 went down with the ship or died in the water. Only 203 survived to be rescued by Japanese destroyers. It was Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon's excited radio call minutes later about scratching one Flattop that became one of the most famous transmissions of the Pacific War. While the Americans celebrated their first carrier victory, the Japanese strike force was dealing with its own case of mistaken identity. The target they had been sent to attack, reported as a carrier and cruiser, turned out to be the oiler USS Neosho and destroyer USS Sims, both detached from Fletcher's main force. At 9:26 a.m., the Japanese aircraft found these isolated ships approximately 350 miles south of the main Japanese carriers. The Americans had no fighter protection and minimal anti-aircraft armament. The destroyer Sims, under Lieutenant Commander Wilford Hyman, took 3 direct bomb hits and broke in half, sinking in just minutes at position 16 degrees 5 minutes south, 158 degrees 3 minutes east. Of her crew of 192 men, only 14 survived, picked up 4 days later after drifting in a life raft under the blazing tropical sun. The oiler Neosho, captained by Commander John Phillips, proved tougher. Despite absorbing 7 direct hits and numerous near misses that ruptured fuel tanks and started fires, the big oiler refused to sink. She wallowed dead in the water, burning and listing heavily, but remained afloat. Her crew fought the fires and abandoned ship in good order, and Phillips and several dozen men reboarded to try to save their vessel. They drifted for 4 days before being spotted by the destroyer USS Henley on the 11th of May. The ordeal proved horrific for the men adrift on rafts, exposed to the sun and without adequate water. When rescue finally came, 159 men from Neosho's crew had perished, along with 1 sailor from Yorktown who had been aboard as a passenger. Phillips had to give the order to scuttle his ship with gunfire, and Neosho slipped beneath the waves after her long agony. Admiral Hera now realized that his main strike force had wasted its ordnance on secondary targets, while the American carriers remained unlocated and very much a threat. At 11:30 a.m., a Japanese scout finally reported the actual position of Fletcher's carriers, but it was too late. The strike aircraft were returning, low on fuel, and would need to land, rearm, and refuel before another mission could be launched. Fletcher faced the same limitation. Both carrier forces had bloodied their noses without landing a decisive blow on the enemy's main strength. As the afternoon of the 7th wore on, both admirals ordered their fleets to steam toward each other during the night, setting up what everyone knew would be the decisive clash on the following day. That evening, Admiral Hera made a controversial decision that demonstrated both the aggressive spirit of the Japanese naval aviators and the risks inherent in carrier operations. At approximately 4:30 p.m., with sunset less than 2 hours away, Hera launched 27 aircraft from Shokaku and Zuikaku, 12 torpedo bombers and 15 dive bombers, to conduct a late afternoon strike against the American carriers, now estimated to be about 95 miles to the south. The Japanese air crews flew into deteriorating weather and gathering darkness, searching for the American fleet in conditions that made navigation treacherous. At approximately 6:30 p.m., the Japanese aircraft actually encountered American fighters on combat air patrol, and a confused melee erupted in the twilight. 3 Japanese aircraft were shot down and several more damaged, but worse was to come. The surviving Japanese pilots, lost in the darkness and desperately low on fuel, began trying to find their way back to their own carriers. In one of the most surreal moments of the battle, several Japanese aircraft, mistaking the American carriers for their own in the darkness, actually attempted to enter the landing pattern of the Yorktown. American gunners held their fire on orders, not wanting to give away their position, while the Japanese pilots circled in the gloom before realizing their error and fleeing into the night. Of the 27 aircraft Hera had launched, only 9 managed to find their carriers and land safely, though some of these crash-landed on deck with damage. 18 aircraft were lost, shot down by fighters, destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, or ditched in the sea when they ran out of fuel, searching for their carriers in the darkness. It was a devastating loss of veteran air crews, men who could not easily be replaced. The night of the 7th to 8th of May brought no rest to either fleet. Both sides knew that dawn would bring the decisive confrontation. Fletcher and Fitch spent the evening hours planning their strike, studying intelligence reports, and positioning their carriers for the morning launch. Admiral Takagi did the same aboard the Shokaku, though his force had been weakened by the previous day's losses and the disastrous Twilight strike. The Japanese still had 2 fleet carriers with experienced crews, but they had lost a significant number of pilots and aircraft. The Americans had the advantage of knowing, thanks to radio intercepts, that the Port Moresby invasion force had turned back after Shoho's sinking, its commander unwilling to proceed without carrier air cover. The strategic objective had already been achieved, but neither Fletcher nor Takagi could disengage now. The carriers had to settle the issue. At 6:25 a.m. on the 8th of May, the opposing scout aircraft spotted each other's carriers almost simultaneously. A Lexington scout reported the Japanese carriers at a position 175 miles to the northeast, while a Japanese scout from the Shokaku found the American carriers at approximately the same distance to the southwest. Both admirals immediately ordered full deckload strikes. At 9:15 a.m., 84 aircraft from Yorktown and Lexington climbed into partly cloudy skies and set course northeast. At 9:45 a.m., 70 aircraft from Shokaku and Zuikaku launched and headed southwest. The opposing strike forces actually passed within sight of each other around 10 a.m., roughly 70 miles from their respective carriers, pilots waving at enemies they would be trying to kill within the hour. It was a strange moment of mutual respect and recognition among warriors who understood they were making history. The American strike arrived over the Japanese carriers first, at approximately 10:50 a.m. Weather conditions worked both for and against the attackers. Heavy rain squalls and cloud cover forced the strike groups to separate, preventing the kind of coordinated attack that had destroyed the Shoho. The Yorktown group found the Shokaku first, emerging from clouds to see the big carrier maneuvering violently below, her wake twisting into sharp turns as Captain Jojima tried to avoid the incoming attack. Lieutenant Commander William Birch led 24 dive bombers down through intense anti-aircraft fire from Shokaku and her escorting cruisers. The Aichi Type 99 Val dive bombers were known for accuracy, but the American Douglas SBD Dauntless proved equally deadly in skilled hands. Two 1,000-pound bombs smashed into Shokaku's flight deck forward, ripping open the wooden planking and starting fires in the hangar below. A third bomb struck near the island superstructure, killing and wounding dozens of men. Meanwhile, the Lexington strike group had lost the Japanese carriers in the clouds and poor visibility. Commander William Alt led his aircraft in expanding search patterns, burning precious fuel, while Yorktown's aircraft pressed home their attack. Finally, at 11:30 a.m., Alt spotted the Zuikaku emerging from a rain squall and immediately ordered his attack, but Captain Tametsu Arima, commanding Zuikaku, steered his carrier directly into the heart of a heavy rain squall, and the American torpedo planes and dive bombers lost sight of their target in the deluge. They circled, searching, but Zuikaku had vanished into the weather. Alt refused to waste his ordnance and led his aircraft back toward where Shokaku should be, arriving just as Yorktown's attack was concluding. More dive bombers screamed down, and one more 1,000-pound bomb exploded on Shokaku's flight deck aft. 3 bomb hits in total had been scored, and while Shokaku remained afloat and operational, her flight deck was too damaged to launch or recover aircraft. She was effectively out of the battle. Captain Jojima turned her northeast at maximum speed, heading for home and the repair facilities at Kure Naval Arsenal in Japan. What the American pilots didn't know was that they had just ensured Shokaku would miss the Battle of Midway 1 month later, an absence that would prove catastrophic for the Japanese. While the Americans were attacking Shokaku, the Japanese strike force descended on Lexington and Yorktown. At 11:13 a.m., the American radar operators picked up the incoming raid, approximately 70 miles out. Fletcher immediately launched every available fighter, and the combat air patrol climbed for altitude, while the 2 carriers turned into the wind to maximize their maneuverability. Lieutenant Commander Paul Ramsey led Fighting Squadron 2 from Lexington, flying Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters that were outmatched by the nimble Zeros in speed and maneuverability, but could absorb tremendous punishment. The American fighters tore into the Japanese formation, but there were too many attackers. Some of the Japanese aircraft broke through and began their runs on the carriers below. At 11:18 a.m., the first wave struck Lexington. Captain Frederick Sherman conned the massive carrier through a series of hard turns, her 36,000-ton bulk responding sluggishly compared to the lighter Yorktown maneuvering nearby. The Japanese executed a classic anvil attack, with torpedo planes boring in from both port and starboard to bracket the carrier and force her into the track of at least some of the torpedoes. Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki coordinated the attack brilliantly, his Type 97 Kate torpedo bombers dropping their 1,780-pound Type 91 aerial torpedoes from an altitude of just 200 feet and a distance of approximately 500 yards. Captain Sherman saw the torpedoes tracking toward his ship through the clear, tropical water, white wakes drawing straight lines toward Lexington's hull. He ordered hard turns, but the enormous carrier couldn't evade them all. At 11:20 a.m., a torpedo struck the port side, near the forward aviation fuel tanks. 7 seconds later, A second torpedo hit further aft on the port side. The big carrier shuddered from the massive underwater explosions and immediately began listing 7 degrees to port. Simultaneously, Val dive bombers screamed down on Lexington from high altitude. Anti-aircraft fire from the carrier and her escorts filled the sky with black puffs of flak, and several Japanese aircraft tumbled out of their dives in flames, but others pressed through. At 11:20 a.m., a 242-kilogram bomb struck the carrier's port forward 127mm gun gallery, penetrated to the crew's galley, and exploded, killing dozens of men instantly. Minutes later, a second bomb hit the massive smokestack, exploding inside and wrecking several boiler uptakes. The damage control parties aboard Lexington immediately went to work, counter-flooding to correct the list and fighting fires that had started in several compartments. By 11:40 a.m., the list had been reduced to 2 degrees, and the fires appeared to be under control. Captain Sherman increased speed to 24 knots and began recovering aircraft. To observers, Lexington appeared hurt but far from finished. Yorktown fared better, though only narrowly. Captain Elliot Buckmaster maneuvered his carrier with greater agility than the massive Lexington could manage, and his crew had the advantage of watching the Japanese attack Lexington first, learning from what they observed. When the torpedo planes swung toward Yorktown, Buckmaster anticipated their moves and turned his carrier to present the narrowest possible target. 8 torpedoes were launched at Yorktown, and Buckmaster managed to comb the wakes of all but one. At 11:27 a.m., a single Type 91 torpedo struck Yorktown's port side amidships, causing significant flooding and damage, but not compromising her ability to operate. Dive bombers attacked immediately afterward, and one 242-kilogram bomb smashed through the flight deck and exploded 3 decks down, starting fires and killing 37 men. But Yorktown's damage control teams proved superbly trained, containing the fires and shoring up bulkheads within minutes. By noon, Yorktown was recovering her aircraft and preparing to launch additional strikes if needed. The Japanese strike force turned for home, having lost a significant number of aircraft to fighters and anti-aircraft fire, but believing they had scored killing blows on at least one American carrier. Admiral Hara, orbiting north of the battle area with the damaged Shokaku and the undamaged Zuikaku, now faced a critical decision. His aircrew reported heavy damage to one American carrier and probable hits on the second, but Shokaku could no longer operate aircraft and would have to withdraw. Zuikaku remained fully operational, but 2 days of intense combat had reduced her air group to approximately 40 aircraft, far below her normal complement and insufficient for sustained offensive operations. She had lost too many aircraft and pilots to continue the fight effectively. The decision was taken out of Hara's hands by Admiral Midway, the overall operation commander, who ordered both carriers to retire northward. The Port Moresby invasion had been postponed indefinitely, and Midway saw no reason to risk his remaining carrier strength. Fletcher faced his own difficult decisions. Lexington appeared to be damaged but operational, recovering aircraft and steaming at 24 knots. Yorktown had taken a torpedo hit but seemed to be managing her damage well. Both carriers had depleted air groups after 2 days of intense operations, and Fletcher's destroyers were running low on fuel. At 12:47 p.m., disaster struck Lexington without warning. Deep in the carrier's bowels, aviation fuel vapors from the ruptured forward tanks had been accumulating in unventilated spaces. A single spark from a generator motor ignited the vapor, and a massive explosion ripped through the carrier's interior spaces. Men were thrown off their feet throughout the ship, and fires broke out in multiple compartments. Minutes later, at 1:25 p.m., a second explosion, even larger than the first, erupted from the ship's depths. These internal explosions, caused by vapors from the earlier torpedo damage, proved far more lethal than the Japanese weapons that had caused the initial damage. Commander Herbert Healy, the ship's damage control officer, organized parties to fight the spreading fires. But the situation deteriorated rapidly. Explosions continued sporadically as ammunition cooked off and more fuel vapors ignited. By 2:45 p.m., fires raged out of control throughout the ship, and Captain Sherman made the agonizing decision to prepare to abandon ship. At 5:07 p.m., Sherman passed the word to abandon ship, and the well-trained crew began going over the side in orderly fashion, following procedures they had practiced dozens of times. Destroyers moved alongside to pick up survivors, taking off 2,735 men from Lexington's crew of 2,951. Among those rescued was Admiral Fitch, who transferred his flag to a cruiser. Captain Sherman walked the length of his burning ship before descending a line into the water at 5:40 p.m., the last man to leave. The destroyer USS Phelps was given the melancholy task of ensuring Lexington didn't fall into enemy hands. At 7:52 p.m., Phelps fired 5 torpedoes into the burning hulk. At 8:00 p.m., as tropical darkness descended on the Coral Sea, the USS Lexington, one of America's finest carriers, settled by the stern and slipped beneath the waves at position 15 degrees, 12 minutes south, 155 degrees, 30 minutes east. She took 216 of her crew with her, men killed by the Japanese attack or the subsequent internal explosions. The Battle of the Coral Sea was over. Both sides claimed victory, and in narrow terms, both had justification. The Japanese had sunk an American fleet carrier, the destroyer Sims, and the oiler Neosho, while damaging Yorktown. The Americans had sunk the light carrier Shoho and heavily damaged Shokaku, while shooting down more Japanese aircraft than they had lost themselves. But the strategic outcome was unambiguous. The Port Moresby invasion had been turned back, marking the first time in the war that a major Japanese offensive had been stopped. Australia's northern approaches remained in Allied hands, and the vital sea lanes to the United States remained open. More importantly, the Japanese had lost approximately 90 aircraft and, critically, 77 veteran aircrews who could not be replaced. Shokaku would spend months under repair and would miss the Battle of Midway. Zuikaku had emerged physically undamaged, but she had lost so many aircraft and pilots that she required a complete re-equipment with new air groups, and would also miss Midway. At the decisive battle 1 month later, the absence of these 2 fleet carriers and their veteran air groups would prove catastrophic for Japanese ambitions in the Pacific. The Battle of the Coral Sea proved that aircraft carriers were now the dominant weapons of naval warfare, and that battles could be fought and decided by aircraft alone, across distances that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations of naval officers. The battle also revealed the immense challenges of coordinating complex operations across vast distances using primitive radar and radio communications, where scouting errors could send entire strike forces to the wrong targets, and where commanders made life-or-death decisions based on fragmentary information. Admiral Fletcher was criticized by some for his caution and for detaching to refuel at critical moments. But his handling of his outnumbered force against veteran Japanese carriers demonstrated sound tactical judgment. He preserved Yorktown, which would play a crucial role at Midway, and he achieved the strategic objective of stopping the Port Moresby invasion. The damaged Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor on the 27th of May, her hull still showing the torpedo damage from the Coral Sea. Navy experts estimated she would need 3 months of repair work in dry dock. Admiral Nimitz gave them 3 days. Round-the-clock work by 400 shipyard workers got Yorktown patched up and operational, though far from fully repaired, and she sailed for Midway on the 30th of May. At Midway on the 4th of June, Yorktown's aircraft would help sink 2 Japanese carriers before Yorktown herself was torpedoed and sunk. Her sacrifice at Midway, still carrying unrepaired damage from the Coral Sea, helped turn the tide of the Pacific War. Captain Sherman went on to command other carriers and retired as a four-star admiral. Admiral Fletcher continued to lead carrier forces through Guadalcanal before being reassigned to shore commands, his aggressive tactics at Coral Sea unfairly overshadowed by critics who didn't understand the challenges he had faced. Admiral Takagi and Admiral Hara continued to command Japanese carrier forces, but they never again enjoyed the decisive superiority in numbers and experience that they had possessed in the war's first 6 months. The crew of Lexington, scattered across several ships after their carrier's loss, eventually formed the nucleus of crews for other carriers. Her name was immediately reassigned to a new carrier under construction, CV-16, which was commissioned in February 1943 and served with distinction through the rest of the war. The original Lexington, CV-2, was discovered in March 2018 by a research vessel, sitting upright on the seafloor at a depth of approximately 10,000 feet, remarkably well preserved in the dark, cold waters of the Coral Sea. Her aircraft are still visible on the seabed nearby, scattered around the wreck, silent testimony to the battle that changed naval warfare forever and marked the beginning of the end of Japanese expansion in the Pacific.